Hi, it's me again, and I'm actually here finally for the First Ladies episode. And before I start, I wanted to apologize for being a little late. This is the third time I'm doing this video. The first time I didn't give myself enough space and time to be able to do it. I tried to squeeze it into my schedule, and that just didn't work. And then I did another one earlier this week, and I had so many interruptions and technical difficulties that I just decided to delete it and start again when I had the chance. So today is the first episode. I will talk about Martha Washington, and tomorrow evening I will do a live video and we'll just chit chat and I'll show you some cross stitch patterns and things. Yeah, so that's it. So I am going to get into this because the last one I did, I think it was a little too long. Now, before I get going, I do want to say that not every detail of these ladies' lives will be in here. Those would be episodes that are way too long. They may not even be chronologically perfectly correct. And sometimes when I'm on camera, I misspeak, and, you know, if I do something like call Martha Washington Martha Stewart, just ignore me, and we'll just roll with it because I am not a historian. We are just chit-chatting about people who like history and or people in history, and those of you that are interested in it. And I'm just like one of you. I've just read up on it and would not consider myself an expert. So that's my disclaimer. So let's just jump into it. So, Martha Washington. Now, Martha. I hope you like Martha. One of the things, I'm going to tell you a few little stories about her and her background. And for the needlework part of this episode, I will talk a little bit about Virginia samplers and what I have researched into that. And I found that very interesting. Martha, I wouldn't say has ever been one of my favorite first ladies. I would say I would kind of be neutral. I've always liked Martha, but have never really put her at the very top of my list. And definitely after researching, I think I like her a bit more. I understand her a bit more. And one of the themes that you'll see me talking about is she had a very strong maternal instinct, and I can definitely relate to that and find that she and I definitely have that in common. So another thing, I'm not going to bog you down with a lot of dates and stuff, so I'll throw out a few, but you know, it can get boring when you get too deep in the details. But Martha Washington was born June 2nd, 1731 in New Kent County, Virginia. Her father was an English immigrant. He was a planter and a shopkeeper, and her mother was older Williamsburg. Her Martha's grandfather and great-grandfather were early settlers of Williamsburg. So I think Martha was the fourth generation on her mother's side born into that area. And so they sort of had a name around town. And if you visit Colonial Williamsburg today, there is a lot of connections to Martha's mother's family, as well as to her marriage to her first husband. Martha was the oldest of 8 kids. New Kent County is outside of Williamsburg, but all of their socializing and sort of the upper crust maybe would gather in Williamsburg for all of those type of events. Her family is described as lower gentry, so more money than a lot, but less money than quite a few. It kind of sounds like that might have been described as maybe an upper middle class of today, comfortable, like I said, more than a lot of people, but not wealthy by any means. So Martha grows up. By all accounts, everything I've read, she was a beautiful young lady, very attractive, and people really describe her as the kind of personality that people really loved and wanted to get to know, and she had this great spirit about her. Now, I don't know if she was courted by a lot of men. or boys, but at some point, a man named Daniel Custis becomes interested in her. He is 20 years older than her. He is from New Kent County, but he is from a very wealthy Williamsburg family. And from what I've read, she did not realize this, just how wealthy he was. And I'm not sure that she really knew a lot. If she didn't know that, she didn't know a lot about his father. And his father's name was John Custis, and he was a very wealthy man. And it sounds like he was very much a Ebenezer Scrooge type. He was very cranky, not a very pleasant guy. He, just as a description of his character, when he passed away at 71 years of age, and he wrote in his will what he wanted printed on his gravestone. And it basically says that his whole life was miserable other than the 7 years that he was a bachelor. He basically hated his wife. When he died, his wife had been dead for 35 years, and he still couldn't get over that he hated the woman and was miserable every moment he was with her. And what cracks me up about the inscription on his gravestone is that at the bottom, it says that this was written at his request. So I am assuming his family, possibly his son Daniel, wanted people to know, hey, we didn't write this. This is what the guy wanted. He was kind of a jerk. So Daniel goes to his father and says, I want to marry Martha Dandridge. And his father says, basically, no way. The Dandridges are beneath us. They're scum of the earth. No way are any Dandridges going to get their hands on my money. It's just not going to happen. Now, Daniel was an older bachelor at this point because his father kept shooting down all these women that he's bringing to him that he wants to marry. Nobody's good enough for him or the family or to get any of the money. So, and this is where I will read you a little passage from one of my books I have used as research. At some point, people told John Custis, you're crazy to not let your son marry Martha Dandridge. She's a catch. She's wonderful. You're nuts to let this woman go by. Your son will basically never get married to anybody as good as Martha Dandridge. So he agrees to have a meeting with Martha, and quite a few historians, books I've read, interviews I've seen, they all mention this story, and they all say, we really wonder, we'd give anything to see what Martha said to this cranky old man. A man named James Power, after this meeting, writes a letter to Daniel Custis in New Kent County, and I'm going to read you what the letter said, because it's kind of funny. It said, this comes at last to bring you the news that I believe will be most agreeable to you of any you have heard, that you may not be long in suspense. I shall tell you at once. I am empowered by your father to let you know that he heartily and willingly consents to your marriage with Miss Dandridge, that he has so good a character of her that he had rather you should have her than any lady in Virginia. Nay, if possible, he is as much enamored with her character as you are with her person, and this is owing chiefly to a prudent speech of her own. Hurry down immediately for fear he should change the strong inclination he has to your marrying directly. So this guy, James Power, is like, get your buns home, marry Martha, get the deed done before your cranky dad changes his mind. So they did. So Martha marries Daniel Custis in 1749, and she was 18. And from what I've read, it was definitely a love match. They did fall in love. Daniel did not sound like he was very much like his father, that he was a kind man. They say he was handsome. I have seen the portrait painting of him. I don't see that, but I'm not a colonial lady, so apparently the colonial ladies found him very attractive. And they had a nice life. She instantly becomes this wealthy woman, one of the wealthiest women in Virginia, being married to a Custis, and he showers her with the finest clothing and shoes and home goods and all of these things. Now, the Custis estate was 18,000 acres, which I pulled out my calculator, and that's about 29 miles, 28, 29 miles. And they owned 300 enslaved people. So this is a monster property owner in Virginia. So they get married, they're happy, they immediately start having children. Their first child is, now one of the other things is the children have to be named Parke Custis in order to inherit the wealth of John Custis and the Custis estate. So Daniel and Martha have their first child, Daniel Parke Custis, named after his father. Shortly after they did marry, Daniel's father, the cranky one, John, does pass away pretty quickly after they're married. They have a daughter named Frances, and I believe they called her Franny or Fanny. I think it's Franny. And she was named after Martha's mother and grandmother. Then they have John Custis, and they called him Jackie. And then they had Martha Parke Custis, who they called Patsy. And Patsy was a nickname for Martha. They also called Martha Washington Patsy. And it gets very confusing because there's a lot of these names that are very similar in the subsequent generations. And this is where I'm afraid I'm going to misspeak. I think I'm doing good so far. So they get married. Their life together is very happy. They're only married for 7 years. Now, their oldest child dies at about the age of 2 of malaria, which was very common in the Virginia colonies. It's damp, it's dirty, it's gross, a lot of mosquitoes. He passes away of malaria. Then their daughter, Frances, passes away. I'm not real clear on what she had, but she was a little over the age of 4, and she was just starting to read and write, and Martha was teaching her. And at this time, a lot of Virginia families, the girls were taught at home, girls and boys. They could be sent away to school, and some did. Martha Washington, was probably educated at home. Or possibly had a tutor brought in. I'm not sure it's real clear who taught Martha Washington, but Martha is said to have been teaching her children in the home. So her daughter Frances dies in the spring. In July of that same year, in the middle of the summer, her son Jackie, who is very young, and her husband, Daniel, both catch some sort of throat infection. And they're not really sure what it is. It could have been strep, could have been scarlet fever, it could have been a number of things. And they got terribly ill, and Jackie survives. He's fine. But Daniel, they say, slowly suffocated from a swollen throat, and he passes away. So at this point, she is a widow with 2 children, 2 small children. Jackie and Patsy are the 2 that are left. And she inherits all of this wealth and is immediately an incredibly wealthy woman. Daniel Custis did not leave a will, and the law at that time was that she could inherit everything and run it. According to the Custis will, she inherited 1/3 of the Custis estate, and her remaining 2 children each got 1/3 that she would control until they were of age. I apologize for the dog barking in the background. I can't control her today. Oh boy. I've got to get this done. So, Martha inherits all this vast wealth, and she immediately takes charge. I thought this was kind of interesting. Apparently, she was very good at bookkeeping. She was a real smart gal. And immediately upon her husband's death, she writes letters to these merchants and dealers and things in London and all of these business associates of her husband, and lets them know that she will be in charge. Her husband is gone. She hopes to have a good business relationship with them. She even called out some people that maybe tried to take advantage of her being a woman, and she thought that a couple of them may have overcharged her on things or not been doing business exactly like they did with her husband. And there are letters of her basically politely calling them out and saying, you know, I'm catching this, and hopefully we can have a good business relationship because, I know what's going on here. So she was kind of a business lady. And she was a widow for 2 years before George Washington comes into the picture. Now, I did have a comment on the introduction video that somebody had said, oh, I really hope you talk about the husbands a bit because I don't know a lot about them either. And I definitely will. Now, the one that I probably or might talk the most about is George, because he is my absolute favorite. And in my opinion, the most important American in our history. Hands down, no doubt. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on George to let you know where he's at the point where he meets Martha. George also grew up in Virginia, and he was from a lower gentry, again, probably similar to Martha, a family with a name. They had some money, they had a plantation, not massive, not as big as some in the state of Virginia, or it wasn't even a state then. But they had a little bit of status and a bit of wealth. He was educated until about 5th grade, so he was mostly self-educated. He liked to read a lot, and he studied a lot of philosophy. His father died when he was a young guy, and he did not, when he was a child, he did not inherit anything. His older half-brother actually had inherited Mount Vernon, from what I understand. He had siblings. He had a lot of half-brothers and sisters. His mother was still alive. But he decided he had to make a name for himself. He was very ambitious. And one of the ways during this time that you would make a name for yourself was to be a military man. They were very highly regarded, very looked up to. If you weren't necessarily uber rich or of the highest standing, being a military person could definitely gain that status for you. So he enrolls in the Virginia militia. And at this time, we're a British colony. And we're sort of expanding. And basically what happens is the governor of Virginia at the time sends George on a diplomatic mission to Ohio Territory. Ohio Territory would be present-day Ohio and parts of the surrounding states. It was larger than what Ohio is today. And the French were there, and they were laying claim that that was their land, and the British basically said, that's our land. So they're starting to have this fight over this area of the United States, what would become the United States. So he sent on a diplomatic mission to Ohio Territory to deliver this letter saying, basically, French, get off the land. This is ours. It's British territory. He takes a group of men. They go out. He delivers the letter, and the French write back. They give him a letter to take back to the governor of Virginia that says, ha, 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 this is our land. No way. This is not British territory. This is French. So this is sort of the beginnings of the French and Indian War. So George knows this is a really important letter and that he better get it back quick. And so he decides just to take one aide with him and an Indian guide. And it's going to be much quicker for just 3 people to get back to Virginia than to take this whole group of people that he had been traveling with. And he's very young. He's in his early 20s, I think. So, and he has no experience doing anything. So he goes on this trek back to Virginia, and just a whole bunch of really bad luck happens, and it's an awful trip. And I think the trip was supposed to take like a couple of weeks, and it ended up taking him like 6 weeks. They didn't have proper clothing. The weather was turning. The horses gave out, and they had to go on foot. He fell in water and almost froze to death. The Indian guide they were with got mad at them and tried to kill them. I mean, it was just very dangerous, very exciting, apparently. And George Washington kept a journal during this trek back. Finally gets the letter back to the Virginia governor. And, oh, great, he's a hero. Well, basically, they printed this journal that he wrote, and it was published, and it was a big hit. The colonists were very interested in this story, this great adventure story, and this young man, this young officer that had this tenacity to push through this difficult journey to get a notice back to the Virginia governor who would notify the king. So he has this he's starting to make a name for himself. And he actually is sent on another mission, and through a series of errors, sort of accidentally almost he basically does kick off the French and Indian War by attacking a French diplomatic group. It was a big boo-boo. So during this time, the French and Indian War would have started anyway, but this is one of the big events that sort of really kicked it off, was this diplomatic group on a mission similar to what George had just been on, being attacked by the Virginia militia. So his name's kind of dragged through the mud. He goes from kind of being this interesting kind of heroic adventure figure to he's not a very good military man, and he kind of goofed up, and, he's not doing good. So rather than getting kicked out or being reprimanded, he actually resigned, went back to Mount Vernon for a bit, and decided that he wasn't going to give up. He really wanted to be a British officer. So he talks his way into being an aide to a colonel. Braddock, I think his name is. If I have that wrong, no need to correct me. So he's an aide, and the French and Indian War is going on. And they go out on this mission. They are out in the field, and Braddock's troops are surrounded and ambushed by the French. And apparently it's chaos. It's just awful. They're totally surrounded, no way to get out, and the general, Braddock, gets killed. And they're under heavy fire, nobody knows where to go, nobody knows what to do, and George, which is one of the things that I love about him, and an early sign that he would be a good leader, is he immediately jumps into action, takes leadership, collects all of these troops, and is trying to get them out of the ambush safely, trying to organize a safe retreat. The French realize that he's in charge and try to kill him, and he is shot at 1,000,000 times. There are bullets that pass through his coat but never touch him. And by his account, as well as soldiers that were there, it was almost like divine intervention. It was like he was meant to be there. They couldn't believe that he wasn't killed under this heavy fire, and he successfully saved a lot of lives by getting these British troops out of this ambush. So he sort of regains his status, and he, continues to serve as a British officer. So when he meets Martha, he sort of has this reputation, this sort of mini rock star kind of reputation. Now, he's not the George that he would become later, which is a huge figure and greatly admired, but definitely he was making a name for himself. He's described as very athletic. He was very good on a horse, very tall, 6'2". Martha was very short. I'm not even sure she was 5 feet tall, but around 5 feet tall. And he had this great reputation as a hunk. He was a hunk. He was a ladies' man. He was sort of a hero of sorts and really had great potential. So when they met in social circles, it sounds to me like Martha kind of had her eye on George. Martha, I think, probably met him and knew immediately that if he was interested, she would want to marry him. She did have another guy that really wanted to marry the widow Custis, and I believe his name was Charles, and he was a wealthy man in town, very wealthy, and could have taken care of her. But he had 10 children. He was twice widowed. They know he was courting her because he had written a letter to his brother or brother-in-law that he really had his eye on the widow Custis and was hoping that she would be his wife. It's probably a good thing she didn't marry him. And I have a theory, and this is one of the reasons that I sort of gave you a little background on George Washington. Martha, I think, she has a lot of money and a lot of control over a lot of things. Now, technically, in this day and age, you would say, well, she never has to get married. I think in this time, it's best to be a couple. Men needed women and women needed men, and you both brought things to the table. It was very hard to survive. And, you know, it was a divvying of the workload and making sure that somebody was bringing in money and doing the planting and the farming and the this, and somebody took care of the home and the children and the cooking and the cleaning, and all of these things were much bigger jobs than they are today. So you kind of needed a partner, and her children were very young. So I think she had an eye on George because I think that she felt like George would be trustworthy. It would have been very easy for her to marry a man that would take advantage of her situation. Once she married, they would be in charge of her money and her wealth, and they could have a lot of power over her. And I think that George had built this very trustworthy reputation. And not only was he a hunk, he didn't have children of his own. But I think that she felt like he was someone that she could trust with this big responsibility she had, all of this land and the raising of these kids. So they do. They get married. She marries George. I don't know. I don't know if I wrote when they got married. It doesn't matter. I have a couple notes. So they get married and they have a really nice life. They go to Mount Vernon. George starts to expand it. So George and Martha get married. They have a nice life for a little while. Now, Martha would also lose another child. Her daughter, Patsy, as a very young child, suffered from seizures. And they now know that it was probably epilepsy. I don't know what they thought then. Even today, there are young kids that suffer from seizures and grow out of it, but that was not the case with Patsy. She suffered from them when she was young, and apparently as she grew older, they got more frequent and more severe, and she did not grow out of it. I think that's one of the reasons they believe it was epilepsy. And she passes away actually at a dinner party. When you go to Mount Vernon and do the tour and you are in the dining room, that is one of the stories that they tell. And apparently George and Martha, understandably, were incredibly devastated by this. Sounds to me like, you know, George and Martha never had their own children. And it sounds to me like he very much took these two children and loved them very much as his own and could not have considered them anybody more his children, even natural born, than these children. So he was very bonded with them, and they say particularly to the little girl, to Patsy. So he was particularly upset as well, again, understandably. Another thing that's described about Martha is some people have said, now I've seen two sort of thoughts on this. I've seen people defend it, and I've seen people say it, that she was a bit of a nervous mother and a little bit of a helicopter parent. I think by all accounts, it sounds like as time went on, she very much spoiled her children. There was just a great love there, but she does have a letter at one point where she leaves her children for the first time. And I can't remember if it was both children or if it was just the little boy, but she had left for the first time after her marriage with George Washington. And she wrote a letter to a sister, cousin, friend, somebody, basically saying that she's incredibly nervous, that every time somebody knocks on the door, that they get mail, that she's just terrified that it will be a notice that one of her children has gotten sick and died, has had an accident and isn't going to make it. And it sounds like this is a fear It's mentioned a few times with a lot of people she loves through her life. I mean, I'm sure kids, I mean, I know kids got sick a lot. And I was just thinking, like, for example, if you have kids and when they first go to school, I have 3 kids. The first couple years they go to school, they bring home every illness under the sun. And your whole family is sick all the time. First year teachers, sick all the time. The germs are unreal. They come home with colds, they come home with flus, strep throat, all of these different things. In fact, one year I remember when my youngest was in first grade, they send those little slips home with, contagious things on it. Whooping cough, strep throat, lice, the amount of lice notices that come home in those early grades. Ugh, ugh. So he's getting all these notices. Oh, lice notices. Then he got a notice for, like, this is first grade, hand, foot, and mouth. I'm like, what the heck is hand, foot, and mouth? Well, I found out because he was sent home from school with it and gave it to my daughters, it was 3 weeks of hand, foot, and mouth in my house. Not a treat. He goes back to school. He brings home a note, and the note, I will never forget this, said scabies. Now, I called a friend, and I was like, am I sending my kids to school on a flippin' pirate ship? What the heck is scabies? I now know it's a skin condition, but all that ran through my mind was this little boy's going to come in the door with a little finger painting and be like, ahoy, matey, I got the scabies today. Like, I was just, holy cow, the amount of germs that these kids have around them. Not only do I want my kids not to get it, but I don't want my whole family to get it. But these are all things that are treatable, right? It's not a big deal to get lice. It's not a big deal when there's flu or strep. We have penicillin. Her kids, I am sure, in a much dirtier environment, they're getting colds, they're getting flus, they're probably getting scabies, I don't know, lice, all sorts of things. And at that time, any of those things could have killed your child. So to me, I'm not sure if that's a neurotic thing or a natural thing. You love these little beings more than anything on the planet, and you just never know if it's going to be something they can recover from. A lot of children did not survive childhood at this time. So I can relate to her on that. I'm not sure that she was unreasonably jumpy. She did seem to, she did throughout her life travel quite a bit and pushed through that fear. So I'm not sure that that's really something you can fault her for. So at some point, she only has 1 child left. She and George never had kids, and this is another thing that I find sort of interesting about George and Martha. Now, when George was little, he had smallpox, and they say that his face was very lightly scarred. When you had smallpox, if you survived it, it could leave you horribly disfigured. That wasn't his case, but the modern theory is, which I think is a pretty good theory, is that they now know that smallpox can also make you sterile. And George and Martha never had kids, but we know that she had 4 children. So we know that at some point she was capable physically of having children, and George had never had any. So the modern thought is there's a possibility that when he had smallpox as a child, that he could have been sterile from that. And I think it's a good theory. It's probably spot on, because they definitely wanted them and loved children. That's one thing that is mentioned about both of them. They are very family oriented. They love children. They were both close to their nuclear family, their siblings, their parents, they were nieces, nephews. They were very close family, not just with their children. So the American Revolution breaks out. 1775, if you don't know a lot about the American Revolution, this will come up a lot in Abigail's story, because Abigail was kind of in the thick of things where the American Revolution started. We were a British colony. There was a bit of a rebellion. To sort of break it down into simple terms, you've all heard of the Boston Tea Party. We had the Boston Massacre. Basically, the king decided it was a small rebellion. They were mad about taxes. We had to create and produce everything, send it overseas, and buy it back at a taxed rate. A fraction of the colonists felt like this really infringed on their freedoms, and it was just getting to be too much, all of these taxes and things. And the king considered it a small rebellion, and it was pretty small in number. He sent troops to Boston to sort of squash this before it got out of control. We had the Boston Massacre. We sort of drove the British troops out of Boston, but as this commander in the Virginia militia with this reputation, George is sent with the Continental Army to New York because they know that the British troops will come back after having them leave Boston. And that is a very oversimplified overview of what happened and where George was and how he had to leave and start to serve in the American Revolution. So he's in New York. While he's in New York, we do sign the Declaration of Independence. And I think a couple of things to remember about that is we decided to break away from Great Britain. This is basically our first civil war of sorts. The actual Civil War was very much, the lines were drawn basically in geography. It was definitely a war over slavery, whether it should be legal or abolished, and how that system would exist or cease to exist in our newer country at that point. The American Revolution was also very much a civil war, but it wasn't geographical. You had families where portions of them sided with the British and did not want to break away, and you had these patriot fighters that did want to break away and form their own country and fight for the freedom to live as they chose, basically. So the guys that signed the Declaration of Independence, it's only about a third of the colonists were really into the American Revolution as it starts. They all signed this declaration to break away from Great Britain. And one thing to remember is we don't have a military, we don't have money, we don't have, we have people that are willing to leave their farms and fight, but they really don't have experience, and we are going up against one of the world's superpowers. It's a David versus Goliath story for sure. The men that signed the Declaration of Independence most certainly knew that they could be signing a death warrant. It wasn't certain that we would win. It looked unlikely that we would win, and they signed it and put their names to it anyway. If we had lost, or had they been captured during the war, they would have been found treasonous and murdered. So to me, just even the signing of the Declaration of Independence is a very brave thing, incredibly brave thing, because the odds were not good for us to win this war, this breaking away from Great Britain. It doesn't start out very well. We are losing constantly. We have no navy. We have nothing. And so George spends a lot of the beginning of the American Revolution retreating and trying to save his people from getting their buns whipped. He also volunteers to do this with no money. And the first revolutionary soldiers that volunteered did sign contracts, but they did not. They were doing it without pay either. They were signing up for a cause that they believed in. Now, throughout the American Revolution, a lot of these soldiers fulfilled their contract and went back home. It was sort of a losing situation for quite a while. A lot of them abandoned. A lot of them left and joined the British military. I heard David McCullough, who was a historian and wrote these fantastic history books. He wrote history books that are they very much read like a novel. And he wrote a book called 1776 about the first year of the American Revolution. And he gave a speech one time and he said something along the lines of, all of these soldiers that joined the American Revolution were not heroes. And he broke it down into numbers of how many of them deserted and did not stick it out the whole time and left and abandoned and even joined the British forces. And so to look at everybody that fought in the American Revolution as these heroes, a large number of them were not. I believe he says about 3,000 were all that George had that went from beginning to end. And he said that 3,000 men are the ones that we should really learn about, pay homage to, and consider the heroes of the war. Which kind of made me think to look in the genealogy, because we have some Revolutionary War relatives, and I need to go through and see, were they the heroes or the deserters? Because I kind of want to know. I found that an interesting note to the American Revolution, which is probably very true. So George goes off and he's fighting for our independence. Martha is running Mount Vernon along with the help of George's cousin. Now, apparently George really wanted to be with Martha. And a lot of you know that she spent the winter with him at Valley Forge. She spent all of the winter camps with George. He called for her and she would leave Mount Vernon and stay with him. Now, winter camp was basically both sides. It's too hard to fight in the winter and the elements. And they would sort of hunker down for the bad weather and, resume duking it out in the spring. And she would go there and she would, letters from the soldiers said that George Washington's demeanor, he might get a little cranky. He was much more calming, at ease. She had a very calming effect on him, and that improved his disposition. He was doing a very hard job. And that she also had this very calming spirit that the soldiers enjoyed. And they know that from a lot of these soldiers writing home to their families. And that she was a great asset, that a lot of these guys might have gone home, and that Martha reminded them of home and their mothers and helped care for them. She and the other officers' wives she organized, and this is where some of her needlework comes in. Martha could do it all. Martha was a quilter. Martha could sew. Martha could knit. She cross stitched. She needle pointed. She embroidered. She did everything. She was definitely a needlewoman. And she organized these sort of sewing circles of sorts to get the soldiers their repairs on their clothes. They knitted a lot of socks. Many of these soldiers did not have shoes. They would wrap their feet in bandages. If you know the story of the crossing of the Delaware, that is the big turning point in the American Revolution. And George organizes an attack on the Hessian soldiers in Trenton, and they do it on Christmas night. George doesn't lose any soldiers other than 2 that died of hypothermia on the trek to cross the Delaware and perform this attack. But many of them didn't have shoes, and they would walk so much and they would leave bloody footprints in the snow. They were barefoot. They had no coats. They had nothing. So Martha really rallied these gals to try to help and make supplies for them. At some point, George really does, he petitions Congress to give them money, give these soldiers money and land. He was losing so many people from disease and desertion. He's like, they need to be paid something for what they're doing. And he eventually arranges for them to have a little something in it for them. Because you got to have, he basically said you can't fight forever on a moral value system and a theory that you believe in. There's got to be more than that if this is going to go on a long time. George still didn't want anything. He didn't get anything for this. So I think if Martha was a first lady today, many of them take up causes. I think Martha would probably be maybe veterans' causes. At some point, he lost a lot of people from, all sorts of diseases that ran through these camps, but smallpox was a big issue. And he knew that Martha had never had smallpox and said, "You can't come here anymore. I'm terrified I'm going to lose you. You're going to die of smallpox." And she's like, "That's silly. I'm here. You need me. These boys need me. I'm going to be here." And he says no, because he'd already had it. So he is immune. And she says, "Well, then I'll have the vaccine." And he says, "Absolutely not. The vaccine was brand new technology and many people died from it. It was very risky." And I believe it was without his permission. She did go to Philadelphia and got the smallpox vaccine. She survived it. And that enabled her to join him at winter camp throughout the years of the American Revolution. So to boil it down, we win. We win, baby. We win our independence from Great Britain. Another quote, I'm going to quote David McCullough again, when he's talked about his 1776 book, which I have read and I highly recommend. He loves this quote from King George III. When George Washington wins the Revolutionary War, he says, "That's it. I've done my duty. I'm going back to be a farmer." And he goes to Mount Vernon. And he and Martha plan on living this life on the farm. King George is told about this by an American that was living over there, acting as, I believe, like the palace painter, one of the people that did portraits of the royal family. And he had said to King George, General Washington is going back to Mount Vernon and walking away, because at this point he is this celebrated, victorious general. We have a new country that we can create where we can make our own way. He could have all this power. He could become king. He could become leader. He could do anything he wanted. He had this great popularity, and he walked away from it. And basically George III said, if he walks away from all that power, and I'm paraphrasing, he will be the greatest man that ever lived. He walked away from it. And he is one of the greatest men. If you don't know about George Washington, I really encourage you to dig very deep. He's not just a guy on your money. So, Martha serves basically as a support role for him. She definitely, throughout the war and throughout his life, she acted as a secretary for him. She transcribed letters, and she was into politics as far as she kept up on it. She read the papers every day. She read her Bible every day. She read novels. She read all sorts of things. She was a very smart lady. Doesn't sound like she got very political with friends and things in her letters, but she certainly was a sounding board for George. I'm not sure that she gave him advice, but it does sound like he trusted her very much, and he was someone that liked to discuss things with the people around him and work things out. So, she was his partner. She was definitely an equal, and she had to handle a lot because she was home alone a lot and had this vast amount of property and people and things to manage. So George thinks he's going back to Mount Vernon. He unanimously, to this day, is the only person unanimously voted president of the United States. And I'm not even sure at that point they called him president. They weren't sure what to call him. These were things they were working out prior to him being chosen as this new country's first leader, but also throughout his presidency, trying to figure out what the standards were, what the protocols would be. They very much didn't want to look like a monarchy, and were very deliberate to try and separate themselves from things that the monarchy would do. So it was kind of playing around to set this precedent, and both George and Martha were very aware of this and very careful about what they did in public because they didn't want to set the wrong tone. That was sort of one of the first political mudslingings towards them, was that they would act like a monarchy. And that really used to apparently tick Martha off when she would read it. They served their first year as president and first lady in New York City. Now, they brought with them their 2 grandchildren. Their son, Jackie, had accompanied, now he was kind of a goof. George always wanted him educated. He did eventually go to college, but he ended up marrying young, and he had 4 children. He accompanied his stepfather following Cornwallis and ended up catching sick in Yorktown. And I think they called it camp fever, typhus, and he passes away. Martha was called to be by his side and was near her son. He was an adult, but he did pass away. So she's now outlived all 4 of her children. Her daughter-in-law is staying with her at Mount Vernon with her 4 young children, and her daughter-in-law eventually does remarry. And however this happens, Martha and George talk the daughter-in-law into letting them adopt and raise the 2 youngest children, their 2 youngest grandchildren. And one of the arguments was they had been born at Mount Vernon. They had pretty much only known that. The older 2 were very attached to their mother. It wouldn't have been fair to have them stay with George and Martha. They talked the daughter-in-law into it. Now, from what I've read, the daughter-in-law was very close with Martha. She loved Martha. She knew that Martha had now lost all of her children and was very upset about this, and it would very much not be good for Martha to take all these grandchildren out of there. But later in life, her daughter-in-law basically said she always regretted it. She didn't regret that she did that for Martha, but basically felt bad that she had left 2 children and taken 2 with her. Now, she ended up having like 14 more kids. So the woman had a lot going on. It was probably a good thing that George and Martha could raise these 2 grandchildren. So when they go to serve their first year in office as President and Lady Washington, there was no First Lady title at that point, they have these 2 young kids with them too. Apparently, Martha did not love this. She didn't love New York. She didn't love that first year as First Lady. It's described many times that she wrote she felt like she was a prisoner of state and couldn't do much. She was a country girl, out of her element, and they're just trying to figure out what they should do. So she did a lot of as First Lady throughout the 8 years, what a lot of First Ladies do today, a lot of hosting and social events. And the Washingtons, by many accounts, did not put on airs. They were very down-to-earth people. They were not stuck up, as you would say, and they were very approachable. And anybody could come to the White House as long as you were dressed appropriately, like going to church back in the day. If you were dressed appropriately, you go. So they were very welcoming, and back then, and for many years, even after we have had presidents assassinated, access to the president, security seems incredibly lax. It's like we really didn't learn a lesson for many years because, we've had a couple of assassinations. I mean, a few assassinations, and I don't know if it took us a long time to learn our lesson, but you had a lot of access to the president and First Lady. So they basically did that. And there's a lot more to their story, as, their story is so long because you have this major event of the American Revolution and the time period that they were raised and born in. I'm getting a dry throat. They were British, a part of England, a part of the British colony, and they go from that to being a major part in us separating them from Great Britain and becoming our own country. And then you also have this other part where they are the very first leaders of that new country. So this episode will probably be, or has been, a little longer than most because the story is so long and I am missing a lot. So I hope that I have so far given you maybe a little reason to look a little bit more into them. So George, serves as president for 8 years, and then he's like, I'm done, I'm out. They were both pretty much done. They had served their country, never asked for a dime, never got a dime. And George had done it for a long time. And so they go home to Mount Vernon, and I believe that it was a couple years before George passes away. So they are on the farm. He's doing a lot of repairs. Mount Vernon's been somewhat neglected. He loved interior decorating and planting, and all of those things were his hobbies. And so he kind of worked on that for a bit, and they continued to entertain dignitaries and had visitors all the time. So in December 1799, George Washington passes away. Now, I don't know exactly. I've read a few different things that they say he's passed away from. I remember on the tour at Mount Vernon, you go and see the room and the bed that he died on. And back when I went there, they would tell you that he died of strep throat. It was some sort of virus or infection. And here's something that's kind of interesting, which I encourage you to read, George Washington's will. George Washington wrote his own will. It was 26 pages long. There is a copy of it on the Mount Vernon website that you can read. Now, I said before that the Custis estate had 300 enslaved people. Martha owned a third of those. Mount Vernon had enslaved people as well. They were there as George Washington grew up, but not nearly the numbers of the Custis estate. When Martha married George, she brought 85 of those. So she brought her third, and the other enslaved people that were part of the Custis estate stayed on the lands that they were working at that time. So Mount Vernon did have enslaved people. And one of the provisions, one of the very first things in George Washington's will, he is the only founding father to have freed his slaves. And without getting really into the weeds, there's a lot of detail to this. I think it's very telling about the kind of person he is. He evolved as a person over time, and through the American Revolution, definitely changed his view on the institution of slavery. He fought along many enslaved soldiers. One of his closest friends was his servant, William Lee. They called him Billy Lee. There are some great stories about Billy Lee and George Washington, and I suggest you look them up. Billy Lee sounds like a cool guy. They were very close. He was with George by his side the entire time through, or most of the time, through the American Revolution. And George really sort of started to evolve in his views on enslaved people. Over the last 20 years of his life, he tried hard to figure out a way to free the slaves that were at Mount Vernon. But it was very difficult. It was difficult because they were actually owned, a large number of them, by the Custis family. And he tried to sell off portions and rent off portions of the land at Mount Vernon. To what he would have to do is purchase those Custis slaves so that he could own them in order to free them. And he could never really raise enough money to do it. The numbers were huge. They were property. It was very expensive. The other thing that came into play is that many of them, George Washington encouraged them to create family units. And not all plantation owners did this. They were allowed to have church services. They were allowed to create families. They were allowed to get married. They worked sort of a work week. They had time off on the weekends and the evenings to socialize because you may not all work in the same area of the plantation. So you may sort of be separated a lot as an enslaved family. The children had minor tasks given to them usually by their parents, things like picking up sticks and helping their mothers weed a garden, and they weren't working until they were of age. So he encouraged all through this time family units, and many of his enslaved people had married Custis enslaved people. Martha never intended to free her slaves. It sounds to me like she was a woman born in Virginia, where that was an institution that she was born into. It doesn't sound like she really gave it much thought at all, either way. She did have a slave escape and had George put out an ad to get her back. Oni Judge, which a lot of you know her story, which is, again, interesting. She felt like she was good to her slaves, and she didn't understand why they would want their freedom. So she never intended to free the slaves that she, Martha Washington, owned. George did. He wanted them freed. And in this will, one of the first things he mentions is his good friend, William Lee. and he wants William Lee cared for, and he grants all of his slaves their freedom. When he dies, his whole estate goes to Martha. So basically this goes into effect when Martha is gone. So the provision in his will, which I find fascinating, admirable during this time, maybe not understood by a lot. He gives their slaves their freedom, but he gives them choices. And basically what he says is that you can remain at Mount Vernon and work if you please. You are also granted your freedom, and you're free to go wherever you want. He realized that there were some of these enslaved people that he had owned that were older and infirmed and weren't really working, but he made sure that Mount Vernon would take care of them for their lives, clothe them, feed them, house them. The other group he specifically mentions is the children, and this is what I find somewhat admirable during this time. He has a provision in there that Mount Vernon will, if their parents want to leave and cannot care for the children, or if they choose to stay, that these children are to be clothed and fed until they're of age 21. And he's very specific that he wants them to have an education and learn a trade so that they can have the best chance to fend for themselves and to live a life outside of being an enslaved people. So, I love that. I think it's misunderstood. A lot of times people sort of get down on these founding fathers because a lot of them were Southern and some of them were slave owners, not all. George Washington was one, but very much by the end of his life was not really in favor of the institution. It was something that was debated, getting rid of. It was debated from Georgetown, really. This is not something that just came up during the Civil War, but it had been debated for the lifespan of our country. And George felt that it was too fragile of an issue with a country that may not survive at all to try and address that during his time. So he addressed it how he could with his own people within his own power. Martha, at the time George dies, she inherits his wealth. She's devastated. She is basically said to have said, "My life is over. I'm just waiting to join George." She very famously closes the door to their bedroom, sets up a bedroom somewhere else. She visits George in his tomb every morning. And she dies 2.5 years later. And that is when George's enslaved people are freed or given the choice to do what they would like. Her property, the Custis property, her enslaved people are given to her grandchildren. That's kind of their story. I thought those were some fun, interesting parts of it. I did talk a lot about George, but like I said, he's my favorite. I think the thing about Marcia, oh, see, I told you I'd screw up her name. The thing about Martha that I like is I do think that she basically was a kind person. I think that she sort of earned the grandmotherly sort of image we have of her today. I think she was smart. I think she was brave. I think she was a woman of her time. I think she was a relatively good gal. And there's a lot more to her. There's a lot more to read about. So I'm going to go on to samplers. Now, I had a lot of people that mentioned they don't really know what samplers are. I'm not a sampler expert. I'm going to just tell you what I have researched. I'm going to talk about the Virginia sampler. Now, I said Martha was educated at home. Not quite sure by who. I think it's assumed possibly her mother. I would assume that Martha, during this time, as a woman in Virginia of their wealth and status, probably did stitch a sampler. At some point, it was probably destroyed, lost. I think it's probably safe to assume that she most likely did one. All right, Virginia samplers. Now, the evolution of samplers, I'm going to quickly go over this. They sort of evolve mostly in England, parts of Europe. They start as a band sampler, which is a long, skinny piece that has sort of decorative stitching on it that would be a reference to decorate linens, sheets, skirts, cuffs, hems, anything you wanted very decorative. And they were reversible, typically. So those would have been sort of pattern books for very, very early ladies doing this that they would keep with them as a reference point to do decorative stitching. It evolves into a part of girls' education. I think that the girls' education in the sampler realm is a little different in Europe than it was maybe in the British colonies and early United States, because we just weren't a formed country. We weren't as developed. So I think we had needlework schools. Many of you may own Bristol samplers. There's quite a few design houses that have brought out Bristol samplers and done a lot of education on those. Those girls that did Bristol samplers at the Mueller Museum, they used theirs as a resume of sorts to get work as help in a home and not end up in a workhouse. I think that probably, and this is a guess from what I'm reading, American samplers probably weren't used quite as much as a resume because we didn't sort of have a large number of those cities with social status and, you know, homes that were using a lot of help in the house in that way. Does that make sense? So it would be much more of something that showed that your daughter was educated and that she would be a good wife. Later, you would probably display it in your home so that suitors could come over and see that your daughter was useful in the needle arts and was educated. So the earliest sampler that we know of, that I could find reference to, was from New Kent County in Virginia in 1742. Colonial Williamsburg, which you can visit, hold on a moment. Okay. Another interruption. If you watch my other videos, you know this is very common. Okay, so Colonial Williamsburg, which you can visit today, it is a sort of tourist living museum type area. If you've never been, or if you're from outside of the country, it's definitely something you could put on your list if you're in the area. Colonial Williamsburg has a large sampler collection, and one of the books that I'm going to reference actually was produced by Colonial Williamsburg. They got their first sampler in 1930, and they started buying samplers as decor for these living history museums. Now, this is something I didn't know, that I read about and I found interesting. They mostly had English samplers, and whatever they could find, basically they were decorating these buildings they had in period decor. They started adding American samplers in the 50s and 60s, and in 1971 they got a donation of 37 samplers to add to their collection. And it wasn't until 1978 did they get their first Virginia stitched sampler. Now, previously, it had been thought that there were not a lot of Virginia samplers in existence. Virginia families, if you were wealthy, you may send there were schools that taught needlework in Virginia, but not in the numbers that there were in the North. So a wealthy family might send their girl to a school up north. They may teach them at home, or a wealthier family may bring in a tutor. And there's a lot of ads and things of teachers advertising their services in teaching the daughters music, dance, needlework, the things a young lady should learn. So you might have had someone come into the home to teach your daughter. One of the reasons that they did not think that there was a lot of Virginia samplers is, I'm not sure they know a reason for this, but many of them resemble English and Scottish samplers. So not until recent decades, when they have started doing genealogy on samplers and trying to learn more about the girls that stitched them and not just looking at the sampler as a piece of art and history, they're looking at the stitchers behind the samplers. They realize that there are a lot of English and Scottish samplers in collections that actually were stitched in Virginia. And these little girls had never even been in England and Scotland. And many of the teachers that advertised as tutors, as schoolmistresses, advertised themselves as English taught, English born. So that could be the reason, is that many of these tutors came in and were teaching them a style that they knew of. And I think I even read some of them falsely advertised as being English needlework teachers and tutors. So as the years go on, more and more are being found from Virginia, and there's a lot more than they originally thought now. Many of these samplers and valuable items were destroyed because of two reasons. Number one, during the Civil War, the North, when they came through the South, they pillaged and went into these homes and destroyed things. A lot of things were also taken to Richmond for safekeeping, and during the Civil War, it was destroyed by fire. So a lot of records were destroyed, a lot of things held for safekeeping. And so it's thought that probably a lot of things were lost during the Civil War. Another type of sampler that was very popular in Virginia were genealogy samplers. Now, it's said that it's very much, now I've never lived in the South. I grew up on the West Coast. I've lived in the Midwest. I've lived on the East Coast. The South is not my zone. Okay. I have a lot of Southern friends, but it is said that Southern families during these times when they would stitch the samplers, as well as now, that they are very family oriented, but they are also very into who they come from, who their people are. Old Southern blood and these lineages. And I think that was true then, and probably in some circles is very true today. So many little girls did genealogy samplers where you would stitch your name, maybe your parents, your grandparents, your siblings, and up the line. Not necessarily looking like a family tree, but that you would sort of be documenting the family you came from and your bloodline. A lot of them had these, and you see this with samplers everywhere, but they had these pious verses, these verses of, I'm a good girl, I love God, please look favorable on me, do your work well, all of these little sayings that sometimes you see stitchers like on social media and things. Sometimes those sayings speak to people. Sometimes they're like, I'm taking that saying out. It's depressing, it's creepy, it's weird, it's not my vibe, whatever. Apparently, a lot of times when these girls were sent to boarding school, the instructors, the tutors, they also advertised that they would teach your girls to be of moral character, and that they would be teaching them the morals and standards that a young lady should learn, and would instruct them to pick a verse or put a verse on their sampler so that when they went home and showed their parents the work they did, they had these sort of mantras, these verses that they were taught as part of being good young ladies. So a lot of them have those verses. They also did a lot of morning samplers. If you read any books on American samplers, there are a lot of chapters and info on morning samplers. And an interesting point is many of them in the United States feature the death of George Washington as a subject matter. He was very beloved when he did pass away. It was a nation in mourning, and many of these girls documented that with their needlework. Let's see. So I'm going to show you just a couple of examples that I have of ones that you could look up and stitch yourself if you're interested in stitching a sampler from Virginia. One chart that I do not have, which was a Virginia sampler, Anne Pasteur Maupin, and that one was reproduced by the Exemplary. Joanne Harvey is the Exemplary. She has an Etsy shop. I will try to link that in the description. It's a chart that I don't own, but she does have kits for that one. That is a Virginia sampler that has been mentioned a few times. One of the books that I have, I mentioned there's a book that was done by Colonial Williamsburg. And it is out of print, but you definitely can find it if you look on eBay. Sometimes Amazon has secondary sellers, Abe Books, Thrift Books. Just if you want it, take down the title and you eventually will come across a copy of this. And this is In the Neatest Manner, The Making of the Virginia Sampler Tradition by Kimberly Smith Ivy. And this is printed by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. And I have gotten a lot of information out of this book. Okay, so I tabbed a few things. Some of it I won't go over because I'm already going very long in this video. Oh gosh. I must have, well, I think I lost my tab, or I had it tabbed. Give me a moment, or hold please, as they say. Oh goodness gracious. Lordy, lordy, lordy. Well, the chart I am looking for, or the picture of the antique in here, is a chart that I have that I could not find. It is Martha Smith. It is out of print. It was reproduced by Handwork Samplers. Oh gosh, you guys. Okay, because I did this before. I pulled out some of my sticky notes that I had tabbed in the book to show you, and apparently that is one of them that I did not mark again. Oh, so unprofessional. Okay, well, I'm not going to be able to show that one. Oh, yes, I am. Okay. So here's the antique. There's a picture of it in the book. This is Martha Smith. That is an example of a Virginia sampler, and that had been reproduced by Handwork Samplers. Again, it's out of print. If I can find my chart by tomorrow night when I do the live, I will show you the chart. But it's one, again, you might want to do an eBay search for that you can stitch. Now, here's another one, and this is in print. This is by the Sampler, and this is Anne Marie Clark. She stitched this at the age of 12. I love this. I love this sampler. This could go up my list this year and really start it, since I'm doing this series and talking about it. But another subject matter that they have found in some samplers is the Marquis de Lafayette was very popular in the United States. He had sort of a status almost as good as George Washington. And later in his life, he sort of would come over to the States and do these tours and speeches and greet people. And he was in Virginia in October of 1824. And this sampler, done by the Sampler, sort of commemorates or depicts that visit by the Marquis de Lafayette. Now, this is done by the Sampler. They have a website. You can order from her. She is in Canada. But there are also cross-stitch shops that carry her charts where you could try and find a copy of this if you wanted to stitch it. So the last thing I'm going to show you with these samplers. Now, this book, it's out of print, but it's not hard to find. Again, eBay, Amazon, used book places. I was saving this book. I have a lot of samplers tabbed in here to show you if I did an American sampler episode. But there's some Virginia samplers in here. So this is Historic Samplers, and this is by Pat Ryan. It's a fantastic book. Fantastic book. All of the samplers in here are from historic homes, and they all have charts so you can stitch them. If you can find this book, it is worth buying. I'm going to show you a couple of the Virginia ones that she has in here. So this is Martha and Mary Fitzhugh. They have a connection to the Washingtons, and I'm going to read you what Pat Ryan wrote in here. Martha, Patsy Fitzhugh, was 7 years old when she began to chronicle the family genealogy, including the death dates of her older sisters Lucy and Betty. She left it unfinished when she died in 1793. She was 7. Ironically, after having stitched the word hence, her sister, Mary Lee Molly Fitzhugh, probably finished it. Mary Fitzhugh married George Washington Parke Custis, who is the grandson of Martha Washington from her first marriage to Daniel Custis. Later, Martha's second husband, George Washington, adopted her grandson. Mary Fitzhugh's own daughter, Mary Anna, married Robert E. Lee and brought the sampler with her to the Custis Lee Mansion, which is Arlington House. If you've been to Arlington Cemetery, been to D.C., Arlington House is still there. It was left behind when they moved south at the start of the Civil War, following Lee's appointment as general of the Northern Virginia Army. Now, I know from research that this sampler had been lost. The sampler has sort of a crazy traveling story, but it eventually was found at the state fair in the late 1800s on display, and that is how it ended up back at the Arlington House. So it's a example of one of those genealogy samplers, and this is what it looks like. So maybe not the most beautiful thing, but kind of a talking point if you were to stitch it and hang it on your wall, kind of a good conversation piece. And that is in here as one that you can stitch. I had another one. I have a lot tabbed. I had ones tabbed that I want to stitch, and you will see this book come up in other episodes when I talk about samplers from other areas of the United States. Oh boy, again, I hope I did not take the tab off of the one that I wanted to show you. You know what? This is the problem with having to have done this a few times. Crud. You guys have to bear with me, and I don't edit, so this is, you know, the other 2 times I did this, this went very smoothly, and I had no problem pulling up the ones I wanted to show. Oh, Lordy. Thank goodness it's not a big book. Ah, found it. Okay, this is Angelina Brown, and she was from Richmond, Virginia, born in 1821, and this is in the collection of the Valentine Museum in Richmond, Virginia. And it says here that if you look closely at the antique, that there is evidence that she pricked her finger and her linen was stained with a little bit of blood. But I think this one's kind of pretty. Look at that border. That's very pretty, and I don't think that's a terribly complicated one. So that's another Virginia sampler. Took a while to get there. That you could stitch if you'd like. So this is just, it's a great book. A lot of you, I think, probably have this, but keep an eye out. So there's a couple of last things I'm going to leave you with. Number 1, I'm doing a live tomorrow, Friday night. I don't know the date, 24th, 23rd, 24th, 8 o'clock on YouTube. There'll be a notice on here so we can chit chat. I'll show some charts that have Martha and Abigail and some of the things we've been talking about. I'm going to do a giveaway. So I want you to, there's one way I'm going to do this. There's 2 books that I really enjoyed in my research with Martha Washington, and I have a lot of books. So I'm going to recommend these, and I will put them in the link below. The first one is by Patricia Brady, and it is called Martha Washington, An American Life. And this is a photo of Martha that she had forensically done with the help of Mount Vernon to sort of take all the portraits of Martha and do an age regression to show what she would have looked like in her 20s, kind of in her young years. And Patricia Brady said this is what really gave her the inspiration to look into Martha and who she was as a young woman, and just a different vantage point of her rather than the old grandmotherly type. So this was a wonderful book. It reads like a novel. So if you're not a history reader, get the book on tape if it's available. Check it out at your library, but I'm going to give one of these away. So you have to be 18. My copy is an old library copy, so it's banged up. You're going to get a brand new paperback. So you have to be 18. You have to like and subscribe this video. I will check it. The comment that I want you to leave is, this is the first video. I want to know right now who your favorite First Lady is. Everybody that comments is going to be entered. If I pick your name and you don't want the book, you'll let me know and I'll pick someone else. I want to know who your favorite First Lady is now. Okay, even if you don't know a lot of them, only through Barbara Bush. We're not going through the new ones, right? These are dead first ladies. Tell me who your favorite is now. And I'm going to ask this again in the middle of the series and at the end, because I'm curious who people like right now. Towards the middle, do any of these ladies sort of rise in opinion? And at the end, is your opinion the same? Do you have a new first lady that you love? Do you still love the one you loved at the beginning, but now you're interested in maybe one or two more? So we're going to start it off with a little poll. Who's your favorite first lady so far? And you don't have to know all of them. Another book that I really enjoyed, I got it at the library and I ended up buying a copy for myself because I did like it so much. And this one is Founding Mothers by Cokie Roberts. Cokie Roberts was a journalist, political commentator. She wrote some history books. She was a child of politicians in Washington. I really enjoyed her. So she did Founding Mothers. This is about women during the Revolutionary War. She features Martha. She features Abigail. And she has 3 books along these lines. And I will actually reference all 3. I have all 3 of them. They're fantastic. There's some ladies in here that you're going to want to read about that you know nothing about, or that you forgot about, or that you would just like to refresh your memory. And this is another book that I'm going to recommend for this series, for both Martha and Abigail. Both of those gals wrote great books. Again, the Cokie Roberts book, it's not boring history. So I think that's where I'm going to wrap it up for today. It's kind of a long one. I'm hoping that these aren't all this long, but some will be. Some of these stories are very deep and rich and, you know, you want to talk about a lot. So let me know what you thought. Hopefully you got some stitching time in. These are the kind of videos where you're not going to have to look up a lot, so you can just hear me ramble and pick up your stitching or your knitting or, you know, cleaning out your junk drawer and just listen to me talk. And I hope you enjoy it. I was really surprised by how many people at the introduction video were very excited about this, and it's made me incredibly nervous that I can't deliver, because I was just shocked at how many people said they were excited to watch me do this series. And as a non-historian and non-expert, to just hear someone ramble about things that they enjoy and points in history that they can remember. It's a little nerve-wracking. So hopefully you guys liked it, and I hope you like the ones that are forthcoming, and I think that I hopefully will get better at this as time goes on. Let's cross our fingers and hope. So until the next one will be Abigail. Maybe I will see you on the live video. If you're not there, you'll be able to watch the replay. Until Abigail Adams, which is going to be uploaded at some point, I will see you later. And I hope to hear who your favorite first lady right now is. So I'll talk to you later. Bye.